Okay, I've started it now on YouTube, so it should be in a few seconds. I'm starting in D4. So this is Wolfgang Ullmann against Robert James Fischer. It started with D4. Okay, I can see a preview board now on YouTube, which is a good sign as well. Is board okay? Was it cut at the top? I don't really know. So knight f6 from Fischer, c4, c5. We have a Benoni, so son of sorrow, Benoni. This structure isn't so popular today. Often there's very standard established manoeuvres since the 70s. This is 1970, this game. But common positional manoeuvres include putting a knight later to c4 to target d6. Often it's vulnerable. If white can extinguish black's counterplay, the structure is slightly riskier than what we see nowadays quite commonly. Grunfelds and Slav defences, it's quite a risky structure, but it's had its heyday. But it's still, an aggressive dynamic option. I think for club players nowadays, they could easily play it and get away with it and get a lot of pressure with the black pieces. So, it's a good weapon of choice in a practical sense. It's just not trendy at the highest levels of chess at the moment. So e4, Fischer played g6. We have bishop f4. You will note here, okay, it's targeting d6, but it's also a loose piece. It's not protected by anything. And loose pieces are potential tactical vulnerabilities. Often there's forcing moves later which exploit loose pieces. They can tend to drop off. There's quotations about that. The famous player Purdy, the first correspondence world champion, said whenever you move a piece and it's loose, watch out for double attacks, etc. For the moment, though, it's positionally motivated. Fischer reacts here with a6, not fearing, in fact, e5. It might be premature. Let's add an engine capitulate as well. Okay. So a4, it's as though to stop b5, bishop g7. So we have an interesting looking Benoni position. Knight f3, castles, bishop e2. And now bishop g4. Black doesn't mind giving up the light square bishop necessarily because it will strengthen his grip on the dark squares. So there's a dark square strategy. You'll notice that these dark square pawns are trying to influence the central dark squares here. So giving up the light square bishop, usually you might think that's a bad thing to do, but it all really depends on the position here. Black, that might be a problem piece. Okay, so white castles, rook e8, and you can see that pressure down that e file. So h3, and this is already maybe a slight mistake. Fischer played a very clever move here. Now the ordinary move to play is giving up the bishop, like I said, but the thing is, yes, this position is slightly favourable to white with the bishop pair, but I think it's almost playable for black. But Fischer actually finds a very interesting alternative in this position, actually based on this loose piece. And I think some of you may have seen this last week or seen this game. It's a pretty classic game from the 1970 Interzonal. I had this game position as an example of tactics actually on the Barnet Chess Club website many years ago, because I thought it was a really nifty example actually. Can you spot black to play here? So if I give you 20 seconds, what would you play with black? Black to play, it's not bishop takes f3. So that's the clue. The ordinary bishop takes f3. Although what I said about strengthening the dark squares, it wasn't played. There was something else played here. Can you guess? So tactics, what is it? They say chess is like 99% tactics. There was a quotation by Teichmann. So here, the general principles are getting overruled by tactics, but how? How is this loose piece relevant in any way, or this e-file? Benoni does create a lot of tactics. A lot of games of Mikhail Tal actually featured the Benoni, and Tal winning, brilliantly sometimes, using dark square play and king safety issues. Okay, so Carlos has said knight here. Knight takes e4. Yes, it's a very, very clever move. White didn't bother taking this bishop now. If he plays this, this isn't too hot because bishop takes c3. And if take very forcing sequence here, knight takes c3, forking queen and bishop. And that would be pretty nasty. This will be a pretty nasty position here, where black is doing extremely well. So h takes g is not advisable after this very clever move. And you'll see that this bishop on f4 is loose here. If knight takes e4, well, this is played. It's now loose after and attacked here. So if hg, we just take the bishop now. So white thought he gained important tempo here. And this gets really clever. You have to really calculate this very carefully. So white played bishop g5, and another clever move from Fischer here. So hitting the queen. So guess what black plays now? Fischer's a very, very good calculator of variations. You know, in the concrete situations we all face, you know, calculation and tactics are vital to consider. But you've also got this very aggressive dynamic opening, you know, the Benoni, which has created, you know, that pressure down the e-file as well. But here, black has a key move, a very important move here. So what does black play in this position to justify his idea? I hope you can spot it. Neat little move. Okay, okay, I'll show you, I think. I hope you can guess it if you guess it after. There's a bit of a delay. Well, there's two moves actually which would give black an advantage. f6 is not so good as just queen e8. This battery here on e2. And white now hit the rook. And we see now bishop takes, getting the bishop out of danger. Tempo on the queen. So black has got a pawn. But the question often to ask if you win material is after, you know, black's got to be quite careful here, because look at these guys, they're not out of the box yet. And if white, you know, has connected rooks, that e-file could be dangerous. So this is a dangerous position potentially. But another very accurate move is played here. Rook b4. Fischer wasn't too greedy, by the way. There was also rook takes a4, because actually the queen's here. But this gets really dangerous. If we look at this position here, although, you know, material up, this is asking for some sort of horrible backfire, because we've got lagging development here. For example, queen f8, ouch, bishop e7. So this might not be so pleasant. It's tricky to play. But Fischer played actually the less materialistic move here. He knows, you know, this can be really dangerous. He plays rook b4, and we still have this rook a e1 idea, and he goes into a self pin, bishop e5. So it's still a pretty dangerous position here. White now played queen d1, and the threat is potentially to play something like f4, and then maybe, you know, there's an attack against this structure that, you know, maybe there's a check, but there's an attack going on here. Now this a pawn is still hanging here. You'll note it's protected only by one attack by two, and Fischer takes that. Bishop c2. So white, no, hang on, sorry. Now here, if bishop c2, this might have been an interesting move, bishop c2, but it's 2 pawns down. But here, this might be minimizing the losses. That's interesting, but black's still doing very well here. In this position, if white plays f4, we get a chance to sort of later play bishop d4 check anyway. So in fact, white didn't bother with bishop c2. You know, he actually just took the queen off, and he's hoping for a bit of play with f4. So he's hoping to break down to this 7th rank. So it's a very dangerous position for black still. Yeah, look at this development. But we have this key check to gain a tempo. And now knight d7. So finally getting some development out, getting these bits out. Okay, now if black is given another move, then bishop f6 would stop this invasion with the rook. So the rook pounces to the 7th rank while it can. Knight f6 now, and white gains the b7 pawn. So that looks interesting. So white's trying to restore material balance. Okay, in this position now, black is in good shape. In fact, the d5 pawn might be that's an option for black, but another lucrative option is knight h5, which as played, threatening immediately that very scary knight g3 check. So king h2 against that. But now look at Fischer's coordination with this next move, bishop e3. He's coordinated the rook, the bishop and the knight now on f4, and that's a pin. That's a very nasty pin. Now you might think, well, can white actually defend f4 here? What about say g3? g3 is not so hot. This wasn't played. White chose actually bishop e2. If for example g3, bishop, sorry, after bishop e3, if g3 here, rook d4, this is dangerous for getting to that 7th rank. So that's not particularly nice. So white chose this move, bishop e2, and black took a pawn, check, takes. So yeah, bishop takes, we take the rook here. So just straight from the opening, white, has lost that pawn in the opening, straight after the opening, surprisingly. But now, okay, so he's struggling. He targets finally that theoretically weak pawn. Fischer simplifies now, rook takes, rook d8, offering the a6 pawn. But you'll notice that this d5 pawn is slightly weak, so the knight, when it returns, can hit d5. We see bishop takes, king g7, and also the king looks to be gliding along the dark squares in this endgame scenario. So black is a pawn up. All he needs is an extra pawn here. If he can improve his pieces, this will be really good. Also, there's going to be pressure on d5. We have bishop b5, and the king comes out again, king f6. So the king is now going to come to this mighty e5 square, not only protecting d6, but hitting d5. Bishop c6 in advance of that, king e5, the pressure is on. Now all black needs is to play knight f6, and this pawn is being wrenched out. Rook b7, rook f8, adequately defending the 7th rank. So black is now just going to play knight f6 and gain this important central pawn. When black does that, then this d pawn is a runner. Check, king d4. Again, knight f6 is on the cards. It's really nearly unstoppable. I mean, I would say it's unstoppable. Rook d7, trying to put black off now because of this d6 pawn. But instead of returning here, there's an amazing little tactical trick, well, in this simplified position relative to the position, that black plays now, which decides the game at move 34. Can you see what Fischer played here in this position if I give you 20 seconds starting from now for the relay delay? So black to play in this position. Can you guess? What does black play? Can you see the final move? You don't want to... Okay, there's a clue. I'll give you a big clue. You don't want to just try and repeat with king e5. Yeah? Because if you played king e5, white could just... if you played this, white could play the check and then just repeat. But here there's a move, there's a different move that you can play with black. A final killer move, which decides the game. Not c4, no. Bit of a tricky move actually to consider tactically. Come on, guys, you can get it. It's not rook b8 either. If you played rook b8 here, then okay, this is good for black, but it's not as crushing as Fischer's move. So this position, black to play. Oh, come on, guys. Forcing moves, even in simplified positions. Let's think about the forcing moves that are available. What important forcing move has black got available, which might seem crazy on the surface? So let's assume you don't mind examining a bit further than your intuition the crazy looking forcing moves. So what would you consider here? okay, I'm gonna spoil it now. I'm gonna have to spoil it. Yeah, knight f6. Yeah, he gives up d6 potentially, but it's a poison pawn here because it's white actually resigned because rook takes. The embarrassing thing is king e5, and the rook is trapped. You know, the rook is trapped. So that didn't happen. Yeah, white just resigns here after knight f6. It's a really crushing, incisive move. Knight f6, simple. Knight f6. Just invite white to take the d6 pawn, which is ironic because that d6 pawn is meant to be the weakness of the whole, fundamental weakness of the Benoni, the modern Benoni. I mean, what do conceptually? Okay, if we look at this game conceptually, what do we get from the game? Well, it's a risky opening, but it scored heavily in the 70s. The Benoni. You can see that from the structure from the opening, black's got the e-file pressure. Black's got a potential pawn majority on the queen side, but black has got that d6 pawn which could be targeted in theory, and it seems the loose piece played a key role in black winning a pawn tactically. So tactics very important in chess. That the routine move was rejected in favour of this amazing move, knight takes e4. But at the tail end, we have to see, has white got any compensation here? Because otherwise it could be dangerous. So this is correctly calculated, creating this bastion on e2. Bishop takes. And again, not being too greedy here, Fischer's move, believe it or not, is the engine move. Stockfish agrees with Fischer's move, which is not to take on a4, but to play rook b4. So this is incredible precision engineering. I'm not even entirely sure what would actually be the bad difference here if we have this position with the rook having munched there. Queen d1. Queen d1 is with tempo. That's the subtle difference. So white is threatening things like f4. So if another tempo is lost, then this starts getting dangerous. So Fischer's play was slightly safer without losing a tempo for that rook on the queen d1. So yeah, this is very, very precise follow-up, this rook b4 business, because this e-file could easily backfire under other circumstances. But here bishop e5 is sufficient. So now taking on a4 with the queen. Yeah, so this position, it looks as though there's going to be an invasion which will give white compensation, but it was invited. So knight f6, and white took that pawn. If white had also, by the way, done this, I don't think this helps his cause to play forcefully here. This position was also quite nice for black. The dark square play is very good. This bishop's actually more passive than this bishop, and it's just a very nice position, for example, like this. So Fischer's play after with rook b4 was very, very precise follow-up, and looking at g3 to fork. So always putting pressure. Like f4 is now that target. It was a very, very precisely played game by Fischer, even right up till the end, giving up a6, but knowing that the king is now marching to the centre in this endgame with the d5 pawn very vulnerable. So a brilliant final resource, knight f6, sealed white's fate. I think, what do we get from such a game? You have to be, calculating very well, I think, if you're going to play a very sharp opening, like the Benoni, and make sure there's no backfires if you do win a pawn. It wasn't just an exercise in winning a pawn. It was, the precision follow-up with rook b4 showed, he was watching out for potential backfires. He had it mostly under control after winning the material, which is the great trick. Often you can win material and your position is off balance. You've got loose pieces, you're losing very important tempos. But here, he kept it under control right until the end. Okay, so let's go and look at now round 19. So we're going in sequence through the rounds. So some games will be more spectacular than others. But I thought it would be nice to just go, systematically through this tournament. Now, in round 19, he was playing the great pianist Mark Taimanov, who he would later play in the candidates, where Fischer, crushed people in the candidates 6-0 a lot of the time. Bent Larsen 6-0, Taimanov 6-0. It was only when Fischer came up Petrosian that, there was some resistance. But here, the 1970 clash against Mark Taimanov, Fischer playing white, so e4, c5, Sicilian defence, knight f3, knight c6. An invitation often for the Sicilian Sveshnikov. This is something I've played a lot with the black pieces myself. d4, open Sicilian, knight takes, e6. We can still transpose into Sveshnikov. Often another route to Sveshnikov is knight here, then e5. This is another route, e6. So knight b5, looking at the d6 square, d6. But here, white plays for a Maroczy bind with c4, trying to restrict black's d5. a6, knight 5 to c3. If we look at this structure, you'll see that the pawns, they're on white squares. Black is often wanting to weaken white on the dark squares here. These are potentially weakened dark squares. So white's usually playing on the light squares and black on the dark squares fundamentally with this Maroczy bind. Let's see how the game continued. Knight f6, bishop e2, bishop e7. Now both sides castle. Now knight a3. Okay, the knight, although it looks awkward there, can centralise like this and maybe help reinforce the binds when it comes to e3. b6. So black is content to set up a kind of hedgehog formation, like a prickly hedgehog, this structure. Bishop e3. Bishop d7, not going to b7, that's very interesting. Rook c1, queen b8. f3. So the scene is set. Rook a7, very interesting from black, as though maybe rook b7 in the future for b5 is an idea in the future with great preparation. Knight c2, rook d8, queen e1. This is a typical hedgehog by black. Bishop e8. The bishops look kind of cute like this, but it's pretty solid on f7. There's a potential here to play d5 at some point. Queen f2 though, interfering with black's plans, looking at that b6 pawn. So black's liberating plans are put on hold. Rook b7. Now Fischer is faced with a potential b5. He clamps down on that b5 with the move a4. Okay, so in this position, you might consider that black has d5 available. If that break and that break are the two key breaks in the position, you might consider it here. It wasn't played actually. a5 was played here. If d5, c takes, e takes, knight takes, e takes, rook takes. In this position, there's bishop takes a6. Yeah, there's a hanging pawn on a6. That might discourage black. This position here. This is okay for white. It's nice for white. So that d5 is not on the cards just yet. This bishop is actually looking at a6 here. That's one issue with d5. Okay, so we have the move a5, which compromises, gets the pawn off that. So maybe d5 coming up without the a6 issue. Okay, so knight d4. Looking at b5, it's a very comfortable parking point for the knights here. Knight takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Okay, so knight d7, as though black might be wanting to trade bishops. Because remember what I said about the dark squares? If black can weaken white on the dark squares with a move like bishop f6, then these two squares will be even tastier for a knight later. So we see actually queen g3 here. Interesting move. Black is not dissuaded from playing bishop f6. He is threatened with mate here. So bishop f6 seems logical. White took on f6. Knight takes f6. But now we do have this backward pawn on d6. So backward pawns can often be tortured and a source of misery. So will Fischer be able to torture Taimanov just with the backward d6 pawn in this position? This bishop is also not looking too great. The b5 break is gone. This is a fixed pawn structure. So if white can keep the bind on against d5 and torture the pawn, then that would be great fun. So rook fd1. And black now commits to a torturous pawn structure now. Torture. White can just start doubling in any case. If black tries to liberate here with d5, he's just going to be losing a pawn surely. The queens look at each other, but this is good. Here, e5 in fact is a snag. Knight takes d5. This is better for white. So this didn't happen. If knight takes, we have knight f6 check, and nasty things are happening. Rook takes, and here actually knight takes. If here queen takes, and we've got a back row issue. So it seems that in this key position, black's liberating break is tactically destroyed. Let's have a look at that again. e5, knight takes, check, takes. This is a refutation of d5, which exists. There was no real choices here. If knight h5, queen h4, this is no good. This position here is just very strong for white. So black, this might explain this seemingly terrible looking move that had to be played here to address these issues, which was e5. So what Fischer's in effect done is lock down on both the b5 break and the d5 break. So this looks like a real torture scenario now, that both these pawn breaks have been extinguished from black's position. So we say about running down the opponent's counterplay, removing counterplay. There's not too much counterplay here. But on the other hand, okay, how does white increase advantage here? Well, okay, he starts with queen h4. Okay, we have h6, and now he builds the pressure. It's not going anywhere, it's a fixed target. Rook d2 is going to start building the pressure. But also it does vacate the d1 square, which is interesting for the bishop. And in fact, it's this feature that is used here. Not this one, but this one. Let's have a look at this position. Why? If this one, knight c5, a4's hanging, it's an important point. How does white actually defend a4 here? Tricky. I mean, if we play rook a1, knight b3, ouch, just fork the rooks. So actually this is a subtle move. It's not just to do this, it's to do this. We see bishop d1. So the bishop holding a4. This is a priority all of a sudden. If the bishop can go here, then it's controlling b3, it's controlling a4. And then white can more comfortably double rooks on d6. So knight c5. Okay, and now again, bishop c2 looks tempting. But another move was played, f4. Okay, so with f4, white potentially, well, with the queen on here looking at d8, white's now threatening f takes here. Black took this, queen takes. This pawn's still pretty fixed. So we've still got an underlying plan eventually to double rooks. Knight e6, the queen drops back. The pawn's still not going anywhere. It's an isolated and backward pawn now. Queen c7. Okay, looking at this, knight d5, check, king h1, bishop c6. So, okay, Fischer's put his own piece in front of the backward pawn, which seems a strange method instead of putting more pressure on it directly. But there's other factors here which are really interesting now. Okay, so rook c3. Let's imagine after this rook c3 move that black took on d5. Can black ever take on d5? No, because we're hitting the queen and the knight. Okay, so that knight's looking quite nice there after rook c3. We see knight g5, bishop c2. Okay, now actually black took the opportunity to take on d5. Rook takes d5, queen c7. It's not so easy, this position. In fact, you might think torture the d6 pawn did seem like the obvious theme earlier, but Fischer in this position does something you might think is very surprising. Black might actually be playing now a move like rook e8 to hit e4. He actually dissolves the e4 pawn for d6. And actually from an engine perspective, it's about equal, this position, funny enough. It's actually a very tricky position to play. In fact, it's not so easy. We can't easily double rooks. So yeah, e5. I mean, okay, he opens up his bishop, takes, queen takes. So if queen takes, we've got rook takes d8 is checkmate here after queen e8, because we're on the h7 square. Yeah? So that tactic works. So rook goes back there, bishop f5. Okay, so what has white got here? Probably, yeah, it's a small advantage of this bishop against the knight potentially, but it has to be proven. G6, h4. Knight goes back. Bishop g4. Knight f6. The bishop goes on this nice diagonal. Rook d7. Rook b5. There's another pawn to torture here now. Yes, this is a long positional grind, this game. White is also now threatening c5 to use that pin. Rook d4. And in fact, rook d4 looks at the h4 pawn. If time is taken to protect the h4 pawn, I'm not sure this is that good. If g3, then rook e8, and black is looking forward to a bit of counterplay with the couple of checks and stuff. So actually a very clever move in this position was played. c5, just a pawn sacrifice, offering h4. King goes here, because we're going to get a very dangerous passed pawn, and there's other ones for the offering as well. But that will be quite poisonous to take this pawn on a4. If rook takes a4 here, c takes, and this pawn is destined to queen after b7. We're just going to queen that pawn. So black tries to interrupt things with rook b4. Okay, and there's another transition. It seems as though this was the dangerous pawn, but Fischer transitions this interestingly. He takes on b4, and he plays rook c4, allowing this pawn to drop. But he will have this a pawn and coordinated with the bishop. And if he doesn't take that, then c6, for example, is dangerous, or rook takes b4. So he takes. So we've got this very nice a pawn now after all of that. But he's also a pawn down here. So this is a great positional sacrifice to make sure this bishop is better than this knight. Very, very interesting calculation, evaluation. But this bishop is clearly now looking great for that a pawn. King g7, and the a pawn gets pushed. Okay, stopping any nuisance checks. Rook a1, the rook gets behind it. The king comes up, and black is in a bad way here. The king is destined just to march over here. Stops any knight c5 business. King d3 can go en route this pawn. king e7, king c4. And now he throws in this very interesting check, a very precise way of playing the position here, to have the rook there controlling that d file, and now play not taking on b4. This is great accuracy here. If he did take on b4, then apparently black's close to very nearly equal with knight d8. No, this is no good, this position. No, by playing king b5, black is in a very bad way here. He actually resigned in this position. Let's see why. So this is at move 58. Black resigned. If say g5, let's give an example. Or knight, let's say the knight moves. Say the knight moves. Check. King b6. Ouch. Oh dear. That's not good. If g5, okay, we can't check here. We just step back with rook d1 to check here. So say a move like this, check, and we get that b6 square again, and it's decisive. So yeah, interesting game. So king b5 at the end, leaves black totally tied up. It's a winning position. So yeah, it's not exactly, I wouldn't say it's a very clear-cut Maroczy bind game, because it seemed as though on the surface, if we go back, as though d6 was an easy target for doubling up rooks. But it seems all the slight nuances for black's counterplay were factored in, because you'll note that one of the prices played was when white played that move a4. It is a potentially loose pawn here to that bishop here. Fischer had factored that in, and the clear-cut doubling on d6 didn't seem to happen. Instead, very, very subtle manoeuvring here. Bishop d1 prophylaxis against a4 and controlling b3 with f4 now, and you'll notice that these two pawns effectively get swapped for these two. But how, if white didn't play this, you might think, isn't this a strange way of playing it? Couldn't white have just put the pressure on d6? Let's have a look for the moment. Instead of f4, let's say we wanted to put pressure on d6 for our own games. We might consider bishop here. If we got this position, well, maybe just knight e6. Yes, as soon as we take here, this is bad news. There's a check here, for example. There's always nuances and tactics for black. All right, so let's try and improve that. Let's play here. Then we lose the c4 pawn. So it's not so easy. It's not so easy. Black has these resources to factor in. So by playing f4, there's no time. Knight e6. We play f5. If here, then f6. Black's king is in trouble. So this f4 was an interesting move, perhaps designed against knight e6. But it dissolved both of these pawns for both of these. And it's funny, this endgame was eventually reached, where the bishop had to be proven to be better than the knight after all that. So it's a strange kind of application of the binding strategy to get an endgame better, and based on this a pawn actually winning the game later, in effect. Yeah, the queenside pressure on these two pawns spelled out the a pawn soon. After this pawn sack here, it's a game. It's a genius positional game, but it doesn't have the clear cutness you would have expected maybe from earlier, from the d6 pawn being backward. It's just a transition into a winning endgame here, which is very clever. Accuracy towards the ends with king b5. It is actually an unsung, kind of positional masterpiece. You could consider it, yeah, against Taimanov. Okay, let's go into another game. Alright, so in round 20, This is in Fischer's winning streak, by the way. So Duncan Suttles is the next opponent who was playing white against Fischer. So Duncan Suttles. Now, after e4, Fischer didn't play Sicilian, but he was playing the Alekhine defence, kind of experimentally in this tournament, it seems. But he did also play it in the 1972 match, 2 years later, as well. So, okay, so e5. White goes with e5, Duncan Suttles. d4, d6, c4. And white takes on d6. Bishop e3. So this is a solid line for white. He's got a bit of space from the opening. g6. d5. He's got a clear-cut idea, Duncan Suttles, of challenging the fianchetto bishop. Fischer takes. Castles. He doesn't mind about... white's weakened the dark squares in doing this as well. So it's a bit double-edged to do this exchange of dark square bishops. Knight c3, e5. White doesn't want to take here, I think, because a nice tempo gain, knight c6, will be pleasant for black. White goes here, but already, black is doing well out of this kind of surprise opening, the Alekhine defence. Black has already kind of equalised here with a very comfortable position. And in terms of dark square play after f5, this knight manoeuvre, a knight coming to c5, is very comfortable looking in this structure. Very comfortable looking. Knight f3, knight d7, white castles queenside. The knight could already go to c5. It seems quite nice to do that, but queen f6 is nice as well. Queen h6. As though there might be some attacking intention, knight g5 or h4. Queen drops back to e7 here. Okay, so rook e1. e4. Now here, yeah, I think if knight d4, that's an interesting move as well. White played knight d2. They're both okay. Knight e5, but black's got that nice e5 square. He hasn't used c5 here, but he's got that potential c file coming up to put pressure down the c file. h3. That knight goes to d7. Queen e3. Queen h4. Pressure on this side of the board. So both of these squares are pretty juicy for black, and he's making use of that. He's provoking some weaknesses as well. White does play g3, committal move, so some weaknesses, extra weaknesses. Queen f6, king b1, knight c5. So black's position is very nice here. Okay, the bishop's blocked in for a moment, but it's no big deal. f4. Okay, so here there might be a temptation to retreat the knight, but Fischer doesn't do this. If he did retreat the knight, then maybe g4 is interesting for white, with potential, maybe trying to get an attack later. In fact, Fischer took on f3 here, takes, and played f4. Pretty forcing, limiting white's options. G takes, knight takes, forcing sequence. Queen h4. So a lot of things that are attacked here. Bishop e2. Check. Here. Rook a e8. Here now, bishop e4 or knight d3. These are interesting because we've got that pressure on e1. So even though he's sacrificed the pawn for this position, it's very dangerous for white, this position. And you'll see also this bishop's kind of hemmed in by its own pawns. Rook c1, bishop e4. Black's going to get his pawn back with interest, it seems. Knight takes, rook takes. So he's going to get this pawn, which he does. Queen c3. So white's got kind of a passive position now. Queen e7, asking the bishop to go back. Rook e3, hitting the queen. Rook ef3, hitting the bishop again. A series of forcing moves here. Rook e2, queen f6. So the bishop moves. Rook f2, down to the 7th rank. That's dangerous. And look at this knight versus the bishop. This is a nice configuration. This knight against the bishop here. This bishop is a kind of prisoner in its own pawn chain. So again, Fischer's just got the better pieces in this structure, and that queen's got a very nice diagonal here, and there's a rook on the 7th. So black's doing very well here. So rook ce1, white's passive. Fischer doesn't mind exchanging off one pair of rooks, and he cashes out this pawn. He wins this pawn here. Rook takes c4. So finally, a pawn up. I think now, so white played queen e3, and we have queen e5 here. There's a back row issue, of course. If takes, we've got the back row mate. So queen e5, and also if here we can play queen takes e2 now to deflect from the back row. So queen e5 is a really nifty tactical move. King b1, sorting out the back row issue, but a pawn down, miserable position. Takes, rook f4. So in this endgame, okay, we've got a 2-to-1 pawn majority here to push. We've got a better knight versus the bishop. Let's see what happens. The pawns start getting pushed. Pressure on white over there. Knight d7. The knight's got that nice e5 square. Again, d5 is pretty loose here in this structure. That's hit. Pinned, unpinned. So that's got to be protected. g5, the 2-to-1 pawn majority is being used. g4, passed pawn has been created. Check. Knight f2. Okay, this is nasty. He's winning another pawn. G takes h3. Threatening h2 now. Check here, and white resigned here. It's pretty hopeless. So a bit of a grind there, but an unusual opening from the Alekhine defense being used here. In this final position, if rook e2, let's have a look at rook e2, then rook f4, and we're going to just tie white down totally with these sort of moves. It's pretty hopeless. So but let's have a look from earlier, just conceptually. So the Alekhine defense, provocation, but it paid off. Black kind of got an equal position here, although white seemed to be increasing some king attacking prospects. The dark squares are very nice for black sometimes. These two squares, for knights are pretty nice, and in fact the knights did arrange themselves around c5 and e5 pretty soon. One got to e5 and the other went to c5 later. So it's just from the structure, they sit very comfortably here. So white was kind of weakened on these dark squares. f4, very nice decision not to play here because of g4. So he took and aimed to sort of damage white's pawns. So there's kind of weaknesses everywhere to regain the pawn with advantage coming up. So once he regained the pawn, this bishop versus knight scenario favours black in this structure. So the simplification later, winning a pawn, nice little tactic here, queen e5 for the back row, and just pushing through the advantage in the endgame without too much hassle. So another kind of grind game, positional stuff, nothing too spectacular. These are long grinding games, which I wouldn't normally go out of my way to cover. Any games over 30 moves, you don't normally go out of your way to cover if you've got a choice. But I wanted to look at every single game in this tournament, so a bit of a positional grind here. What do we learn from Fischer's games? I mean, the weaknesses, the colour complexes, the better end games, the pieces in the end game. He chooses his weapons carefully for the end game. So yeah, I hope you got something from it. Going over these games a little bit. Okay, so yeah, okay, thanks for coming, and see you next week. I'll be carrying on this next week and going into the candidates matches after. Okay, thanks. See you next week. This video will be on YouTube if you want to review it again and look at some points or pose some questions. You can do that on youtube.com/kingscrusher. Thanks very much.